So I'm Miriam. I'm a student at Princeton University, and I'm going to be talking about some research that I did with the McGill Pain Questionnaire, which is a clinical assessment tool that I'll go into in a little bit more in depth at the start of the presentation. So starting with some background and motivation for the work that I did. The study that I conducted was looking at the use of adjectives in clinical pain assessment tools. While in general, numbers are a really good metric for, doctors and scientists in gathering, quantitative data, there's sort of, a thought in medicine and linguistics and in other fields that sort of numbers can't do justice to the, multifaceted nature of pain. And so in 1972, Ronald Melzack, who's a linguist and a physician, decided to look at whether adjectives could be sort of a more robust way of collecting data on, patients' pain experiences and in communicating that data to physicians who were trying to, treat and recognize that pain. So this is obviously a very high stakes undertaking because, communication of pain is one of the most important steps in sort of diagnosing and treating it. And so, this sort of has pretty high significance for the clinical community. And so Melzack, who created the MPQ, the McGill Pain Questionnaire, which I'll hereby refer to as the MPQ, was sort of motivated by this idea that, is pain sort of ineffable? Is it possible to communicate it? And he sort of came down on the side that says yes. We just need more sort of complex ways of conveying it than a number. So, if you think about sort of the classic trope of talking about pain, you can think of, a doctor sort of asking a patient, can you rate your pain for me on a scale of 1 to 10? And now this is helpful, right? If somebody says that their pain is a 10, we know that that's probably something much more serious than if they had said that their pain is a 2. But scales are also very relative. And so it's not always easy to know, right? If a patient says that their pain is a 10, but the most pain they've ever experienced before this point is a paper cut, their 10 might sort of mean something very different than somebody whose 10 is, say, a kidney stone. And so that's sort of the gap that the McGill Pain Questionnaire is trying to address. And then we'll take a quick look at what the actual assessment tool looks like. So this is sort of one page taken from the McGill Pain Questionnaire. There are several sections, but my research has been focusing just on this one that asks patients. It provides a list of 78 adjectives organized in categories, in 20 different categories, that are supposed to sort of represent different qualities of pain. And then within each category, there are several different adjectives that are ordered based on their different levels of intensity of that same feeling or sensation. Right, so if you look at category 11, which is tiring and exhausting, those are both supposed to represent, sort of the same phenomenon, where tiring is less intense of a representation of that feeling than exhausting. And so then this questionnaire would assign tiring a value of 1 and exhausting a value of 2. And that's sort of how the patient would be able to convey to the doctor sort of all of the different facets of their pain and the different intensities that they have. Okay, so then the sort of basis of this pain questionnaire and how it seeks to convey more information than just numbers relies on a concept called scalar implicature. So implicature is sort of a category in linguistics of meaning that's conveyed outside of what is said explicitly. So we're going to look at an example on the screen. If you look at sentence A, the sentence says, Ben likes some of the teachers in his school. So obviously there's meaning that's conveyed just by that sentence in itself, which says that Ben likes some teachers in his school. But then there are some extra layers of meaning on top of that, some of which are conveyed automatically by that statement. So if you look at sentence B, which can be implied from sentence A, it says that Ben likes at least one of the teachers in his school. So this is a meaning that's conveyed automatically anytime that you say sentence A, sentence B is also going to be true. And that's because of a concept called scalar implicature, which says that, if you have a scale, so in this case, it would be the scale from 1 to some to all, where 1 is sort of less inclusive, some is more inclusive, and all is the most inclusive. If you use an element on the right of the scale, all elements to the left of the scale are also included in that. So when you say that Ben likes some of the teachers in his school, it's included in that he likes at least one of the teachers in his school, since some is more than one. And then we go down to sentence C, which says Ben does not like all of the teachers in the school. And this is where it sort of gets more interesting. And this is meaning that's not conveyed automatically. So usually if somebody comes to you and tells you about their child that, yeah, they're liking some of the teachers in their school. So typically the hearer of that sentence would take it to understand that, Ben likes some of the teachers, but he doesn't like them all. And so that's sort of an added feature of scales like this, and which can be, generalized to different adjective scales, where you learn not just about, the elements to the left of an element that's used, but also you say something about the elements to the right of it. So this concept comes from, the ways in which conversation has to function. And so we assume that somebody is giving the most possible information that they have. So if you could use a more inclusive item of the scale, right? If you could say that Ben likes all of the teachers in his school, you would assume that somebody would say that instead of saying the less inclusive some. And so that's sort of where the whole idea of the McGill Pain Questionnaire comes from. Because if you take any element in any of the categories of the MPQ, we assume that not only are the less intense aspects of that category included in any element that you choose that's higher than them, but we also assume that no higher elements are included or do apply. Okay, so in looking at this, I wanted to see whether or not people who experience pain actually use the adjectives in the list of the MPQ in the way that it prescribes. So again, this assessment tool is only helpful insofar as doctors and patients have the same understanding of the adjectives and are able to sort of translate it through this pain assessment tool. So it's really important to see that people actually have the same conception of the scalability of these adjectives and their different intensities, and to make sure that that matches up with what the MPQ sort of assigns it as. So that's what I was investigating in this research, which I'll now explain how I did that. So I used a corpus-based approach to this research. So the goal was to use speech or text that came from patients themselves, since what I'm sort of interested in is showing that patients have the same conception of adjectives as scalable and of different intensities. And so I turned to online forums for specifically dedicated to chronic pain. So there are lots of forums online that you can find on every topic imaginable. Since pain is what I'm interested in for this study, I was able to find a website called healingwell.com that hosts a bunch of forums for people who are experiencing pain in various different ways. So I looked at, a couple different categories of pain, like rheumatoid arthritis and fibromyalgia, which all have pain as one of their defining symptoms. And then looked at the text of what, patients were sort of describing to each other, and asking for help and describing their symptoms to each other on these forums. So here's just an example of like a post. This is what it looks like, where you have, the member who originally posts something, and then there could be responses. And so these forums had hundreds of pages, each with, 20 posts on them with responses and all of that kind of stuff. So, so I went through. I went through and sort of scraped all of this data, focusing just on the text of the posts themselves and the responses to them, and took all of that data. It amounted to something like 25 million words worth of posts, and then did some, pre-processing on it just to make it available for linguistic analysis. And so the next step, once I had this corpus of, patient-generated text, was to start looking at how I could actually infer from how the adjectives were used by the patients, how the patients saw them and their intensities. So my approach for this was by using specific linguistic contexts, which are known to say something about the adjectives used in them. So I'll give you an example. So this is sort of like the table of patterns that I used in searching through the corpus to find the contexts that would be useful in deriving intensity relationships. So I divided this into two types of patterns, intense or mild. So on the intense side, you have something like, if not, where X and Y are both different adjectives, you have something like, if not X, at least Y. So if not searing pain, at least burning pain. And so when adjectives are used in that sort of construction, then you know that the adjective in the spot of X on the left is supposed to be more intense than the adjective Y that's on the right of that. And the opposite is true of the mild patterns. And so I went through the corpus that I had constructed from the online forums and searched for both mild and intense patterns in the text, which returned things like, all day at work, it is stiff but not painful, or the pain is quite sharp but not usually particularly achy. So both of these represent mild patterns. So this suggests that stiff is less intense than painful, and sharp is less intense than achy. And so by gathering all of these contexts, I was then able to manipulate them to sort of understand the different relationships that they were defining. So the next step in the process was to take those contexts that were found and define what I called weak, strong pairs from those. So those were pairs of adjectives in which one of them was, defined by the context as less intense or weaker, and one was defined by the context as more intense or stronger. So in this sentence, back areas can feel heavy, aching, and yes, sometimes burning. The heavy and aching would be the mild or weak side of the pair, and burning would be the stronger pair. And so what my method also allowed for was the inclusion of something like this, where there are two adjectives on one side of the pattern and one adjective on the other. And so from this type of sentence, I would actually create two weak, strong pairs, one which compared heavy and burning, and one which compared aching and burning. So this would lead to the creation of these two sort of partial scales, where we know that heavy is less intense than burning, and aching is less intense than burning. Okay, so I gathered all of those, all the weak, strong pairs that were identifiable from the context. And then it was important to consider the categories of the adjectives that were used in the MPQ, because going back to the concept of scalar implicature that I introduced at the beginning, not all adjectives can be put on a scale such that the implied meanings that I discussed come to be, right? So you can't have the scale, let's see if I put it on. you can't have a scale that goes from cool to hot to burning, even though hot is typically viewed as more intense than cool, just because they sort of represent different categories, different aspects. And so you can't necessarily infer from cool things about hot and vice versa. And so the approach that I used assumed that the same is true of the adjectives and the categories used in the MPQ, such that the adjectives in each category could only be compared in intensity to the other adjectives within that category. So not only did I have to sort of identify these weak, strong pairs, but then I also had to sort of find a way to connect the pairs to other adjectives in the same category. And so to do this, I use the approach of creating a graph. And so in this graph, each adjective that was found in a weak, strong pair was created as a node. And any of the weak, strong, for each weak, strong pair that, defined a relationship between two adjectives, these relationships were represented by edges on the graph. So here is sort of the final product of the graph, which combines all of the weak, strong pairs and all of the relationships that were inferred from that. And as you can see, it's a little bit messy, which I think does a very good job of representing, sort of the problem with these adjectives, and sort of, the challenges in using language for anything very precise, because it's obviously very complex. And so just a few things of interest to note on this graph. So as you can see in the little circles, those are each of the adjectives that were found in the weak, strong pairs. And then the adjectives and then the relationships are defined by these arrows, which point from the weaker element of a pair to the stronger element of a pair. And so you can see in some instances, like if you look at sharp and dull here, there are arrows that go both ways, which in theory would suggest that dull is both less intense than sharp and more intense than sharp. And so this also sort of points to the complexity with, dealing with natural language, since it's not always as clear cut as we'd like. So in these cases where, there were sort of arrows pointing both ways, I prioritized the majority direction. So here, dull was used in a context that suggested that it was weaker than sharp 3 times and stronger than sharp 1 time. So we say, okay, we trust the majority there, and assigned dull the value of weaker than sharp. And then it's also interesting to note that some adjectives, are very much connected to other adjectives that have a lot of arrows coming in and pointing out of them. So like burning, sharp, and aching are all, these would have been sort of like high frequency adjectives within the weak, strong pairs. While others, like the ones in the corner here, tight and squeezing, are much less connected, which suggests that they're sort of either more specific, they point to like very specific types of pain, which can't easily be compared to others, or that they're just, lower frequency adjectives in general. So then in order to define the relationships between adjectives of the same category, I traversed the graph and took advantage of sort of transitive relationships between adjectives. So, in order to connect something like aching and burning, which I don't believe are in the same category, but we can just take it for an example. If aching and burning were in the same category and we wanted to define the relationship between them, so there's clearly no arrows directly between aching and burning, but we could instead see that aching is less intense than sharp, and sharp is less intense than burning. So this would suggest that aching is less intense than burning as well. And so that's the sort of traversal of the graph, finding paths from one adjective to all of the different adjectives in that same category, to see if it was possible to define relationships between them. And so for each pair like that, where I was successfully able to connect something like aching and burning, the relationships predicted by that were represented by, either a 0 or a 1, 0 being the weaker of the pair and 1 being the stronger of the pair. So in this case, aching would be assigned a value of 0, and burning would be assigned a value of 1. So this is just, sort of an example of that using the scale annoying, intense, and unbearable. So for each weak, strong pair, the values of 0 or 1 were assigned. And then within each McGill Pain Questionnaire category, the values for each element of that category were added up. And by doing that, I was able to take the disparate predicted relationships and combine them into one to create sort of more robust scales from the partial orderings. So here were the categories that I was ultimately able to predict relationships about. So obviously these are not all 20 categories, but for the categories in this graph, I was able to use only the data collected from the corpus and using the contexts defined to predict these intensity orderings. So you see, in the category of tight and squeezing, we predict that tight is less intense than squeezing. So, I mean, just intuitively, it's clear to see that two of these scales appear to be, sort of, they don't match with what we think of with the adjective intensities, right? So freezing is predicted to be less intense than cold, and burning is predicted to be less intense than hot. So these adjectives in particular, freezing, cold, burning, hot, warm, posed a little bit of a complication to this method since they were used sort of the most frequently and in sort of unpredictable ways, which is reflected in the end result here, which incorrectly predicted their intensities. So it would be like further research would be required to sort of figure out what the best way to approach adjective like those are, which are used in so many different contexts, not all of which are specific to pain. And so the results of this work, so I was able to predict 17 relationships between adjectives, each of the same McGill Pain Questionnaire category. So going back to this page, in a scale like annoying, intense, unbearable, there are several relationships defined there, right? It's defined that annoying is less intense than intense, and then intense is less intense than unbearable, and also that annoying is weaker than unbearable. So there's three relationships defined there, and so counting them all up, there are 17. Excluding something like where there are backslashes here, that shows that my model actually wasn't able to predict the relationship of intensity between the adjectives. So there were no traversable paths between dull and sore or dull and aching. So it was predicted that all three of these were less intense than heavy and hurting, but was not able to predict between dull, sore, and aching which ones were more or less intense than the others. Right, so compared to the orderings that the McGill Pain Questionnaire sets out, 10 of the 17 relationships that I was able to predict do match the McGill Pain Questionnaires orderings. And so this is an above chance level of agreement. It's not astronomically high, but that is to be expected considering the size of the sample that I was working with. So despite the fact that there was, sort of 25 million words to choose from, the specificity with which I had to define the mild and intense patterns that I was looking for, sort of really narrowed down the results. And in the end, there weren't that many relationships that were defined. But it does show that an approach like this, which uses, very simple and basic linguistic concepts, is able to actually make these pretty sophisticated predictions about language and about the intensity of different adjectives. And the results also suggest that perhaps the categories defined, that while within each category, the intensity relationships between the adjectives seem to be pretty well organized, that the categories themselves might be inappropriately defined. And this is sort of suggested by the way that that some of the different adjectives were used in conjunction with other adjectives and weren't used very often in conjunction with adjectives of the same category. And also by prior studies, which also found sort of weaknesses in the way that the McGill Pain Questionnaire ordered the adjectives. And so that's sort of a very complex question of what the best way to actually categorize them is, since it really depends on how we view the different senses in which these are used to describe pain, which sort of gets to the initial question of this study, which is, can pain sort of be captured in these little categories and words? So overall, there was preliminary support for my hypothesis that people do use adjectives, scalable adjectives in predictable and consistent ways, and that the scales that people sort of have in their minds match up at least to a fair degree with the way that the McGill Pain Questionnaire defines them. And so then the significance of this is that it does lend support to the idea of using a pain questionnaire like the McGill Pain Questionnaire in clinical assessment, since the success of using such a measure relies on the way that both patients and the questionnaire and the physician have a shared understanding of the adjectives and sort of what they mean. And so the agreement between this study and the McGill Pain Questionnaire suggests that there is at least sort of a basic agreement on what the different adjectives mean and their different intensities. And so that's very promising for the McGill Pain Questionnaire and other questionnaires like it. Does anybody have any questions?